What's up, everybody? It is Monday, March 12th, 2018, and this is the Monday Morning Analyst podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I'm your host. My name is Luke Thomas. Okay, so what do we normally do on this podcast? Well, we normally talk about some of the big action that happened over the weekend, and there was definitely some good MMA out there. Don't misunderstand me, but there wasn't anything with the kind of thing we usually cover, which is like top of the food chain, highest level UFC stuff. That's what I usually try to focus in on. Sometimes Bellator, sometimes some other things too, but that's really usually the direction I go. And there wasn't any from this past weekend, but there was something else that happened that was kind of interesting. This is the first time since 2015, I believe. Nick Newell, a congenital amputee, decided to come out of retirement. We knew that, but he hadn't fought in a while, even after his announced comeback. And he made his return to the cage at LFA 35 against Sonny Luque. Now, this has brought back the debate about whether or not he deserves to be in the UFC, because there's a lot of interesting factors about his career. There's a lot of unknowns about his career. There's a lot of debate about his career and what it means in terms of whether or not he deserves an opportunity in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. So I thought we should sink our teeth into that question as well, but maybe look at some fight footage as we normally do on this podcast to help us figure out if he does or if he doesn't, and if he does, what's the good argument for it. So is it true that Nick Newell can't really defend himself from that left side? Is it true that Nick Newell doesn't deserve an opportunity in the UFC? Or is this just a case of discrimination or old biases, or people just don't understand what the truth is? Let's take a look at some of the facts, figures, and video and see if that can help us clarify this debate a little bit. Let's start this conversation where it starts. Now, this might sound obvious. This might sound like overkill. This might sound like, yeah, we know. Okay, so I'll make it fast, but it deserves to be said. No one, including Nick Newell, has a right to be in the UFC. It has an opportunity that can be granted to you, but it is entirely provided you are conforming to the laws of your local, state, and federal government. It is an opportunity. It's not something that you have to have if you meet X criteria or Y accomplishments. This is at their discretion, and if they believe they have some good reasons to not have him in the UFC, that is entirely their right. So when people say, well, he has earned his opportunity or that he deserves to be in the UFC, they might be using that word in a sort of broader sense, which we'll talk about in just a second. But to start this conversation, let's just state the fact up front. Nobody, including Nick Newell, has a right to be in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. This takes us to the next step in the question, which is, all right, well, we know what his resume was before this that didn't get him in. Did anything change with Saturday? What can we say about his performance on Saturday night against Sonny Luque at LFA 35? Well, let's take a look at some of the footage. Now, there's actually not a whole lot of this, and I'm going to talk you through some of it with some of the things to keep in mind. Right? He's won a lot of his fights by taking him to the ground, either by controlling people on top, like he did against Tom Marcelino. He's had good submissions in the past, so it's always something you want to keep in mind. He's probably going to be looking to take the fight to the floor no matter who he is. And then the Justin Gaethje fight, which we're also going to look at in just a minute, he wasn't able to do that, but it's typically something yet he likes to do. And you can see here, looks loose. He's got center of the cage. All right, Luque's on the outside. You could see Nick Newell calm, doing a lot of moving around, not like, bouncing on his feet like Frankie Edgar necessarily, but using the leg kicks, feinting and faking with the hand, right? Resetting positions at times. You could tell he packs a bit of a heavy shot depending on how he throws. And again, in the back of your mind, you're going to always be looking for that takedown. Now, one thing you always want to keep in mind here is you notice that Nick Newell stands from that southpaw position, even though it's the left arm that had the congenital amputation. Sonny Luque standing from that right-handed position. There's a big question about how many guys in his career did he face who were right-handed, and the answer is the overwhelming majority of them. Now, the bigger issue, though, is that not many really took advantage, such as you can say that, about the fact that he doesn't have a full and complete left arm. In other words, there is this belief that he has a certain amount of weakness from that left side because he doesn't have as much to block there with, and that this is something that will ultimately haunt him, and it is something that Justin Gaethje used, although there's some questions about that we'll look at in just a moment. Here you can see Nick Newell already getting him to the ground, has a hook in, right, and now you've got Luque looking for a 2-on-1, And you can, if you ever watch Nick Newell fight, what the tape shows you is from here, he's got a good rear naked choke. He's got a good setup. He's also got a good front headlock series because he's able to dig in with a congenital arm or the congenitally amputated arm, or he can dig in with his other one, and he's got a good lock on it. So the front headlock and the rear naked choke, or in this case the face crank, it's a nice solid grip for him, which he's got. And you can see there is the tap. There's not a lot of fight footage to look at in this case. So what does this really tell us? Is there any real big read on this? And my answer is not really. He looked about like he looked before he left. You'll recall that Nick Newell said when he was done with fighting in 2015, his body was quitting on him. He just wasn't feeling it anymore. And I'm not to say that he has not made improvements. That's not what I'm saying. But he hasn't regressed either. A guy took 3 years off and looked about how Nick Newell looks. Good takedowns, good back control, good submissions from the back, stayed out of trouble. A lot of people say he can't defend, from this side, right? Which would be the right side if you're facing him, but his own left. But here's the truth about it. Those guys who he's fought, the majority of them being right-handed, have never really been able to take advantage of it. Justin Gaethje did, but I'm just pointing out, if this side is a real liability for him, there's not a lot of evidence. However, that now leads us to the next question, which is I could show you all of the fights that Nick Newell won, and they more or less look like this. He had some trouble spots in certain areas, but it was kind of like this. It was the one fight with Justin Gaethje where it didn't go this way, where Justin Gaethje was able to take advantage of the fact that there was some porousness to his striking. So, while it's true that the regional guys couldn't take advantage of any, let's say, blocking deficiencies here, Justin Gaethje was. So let's look at that footage and see what it tells us. Now here I have the highlights from Gaethje versus Newell. And what are you going to notice here? Eventually the right hand does sneak through, but it takes a little time. The big story of the fight to me, which people often forget, is the leg kicks of Justin Gaethje, which are an incredibly useful tool for him. The body kicks that he used on the ground, I don't show you a whole lot of it here, but on the ground he goes over and over and over again with knees to the body of a grounded opponent, kicks to the body of a grounded opponent, all totally legal. And that really began to wear on Nick Newell. And eventually what you're going to see is the left and the right hand begin to sneak through. Not at first. Only in that second and third round did it really begin to get him. I mean, a couple snuck through in the first, don't misunderstand me, but he really began to pour it on later on in that fight. And the reason why was for a couple of reasons. Number one, of course, going to the body, hurting him, slowing him down. Kicking the legs was another component. And you're going to notice, we talk about this on the Monday Morning Analyst all the time, when guys are moving in the center of the cage, they're hard to hit, they're hard to track, they're hard to anticipate. It's just a lot of extra work that goes in. When you push him behind the black lines, and World Series of Fighting, you can see has their own version of this, that's when things begin to change. And as you notice, that right hand that ultimately puts Nick Newell down, it's when Newell wasn't moving and his back was against the cage. Now, in Newell's defense, he and I have talked about this fight, and what he noted was, because of all the injuries to his body, his cardio just was never really all that good as he went through a big portion of his career. Right? He just couldn't train properly. He couldn't get the cardio in that he wanted to. He couldn't run properly. He couldn't do the circuits that he wanted to properly. Like a big portion of his training was impacted, not merely in skill development, but in camp and fight preparation in terms of that. So you can say, well, against the Sonny Luques of the world, who are good fighters, but they're regional level fighters, the fact that he had a congenital amputation on the left side, there's just not a lot of evidence to suggest that ever really affected him. Against Justin Gaethje, you were able to see that. He was able to eventually pour it on, but a couple of factors, as I mentioned before. Number one, Justin Gaethje, literally one of the best lightweights in the world, like literally top 5. And in the other case, you have Nick Newell, who retired from the sport not long after this, in part because his body was quitting on him, and he just couldn't get the kind of training in that he needed to compete at, if maybe not an elite level, because he didn't have a chance to really compete at an elite level absent this fight, but at his best. He couldn't maximize his talents. So here we have his most recent win, and of course his only loss on his record. And it's hard to know what to make of the footage. Let's see if we can make some more sense of it. Let's go back to that first question. Is he able to defend himself from this side? And the answer is, insofar as he takes fights in LFA or even perhaps Bellator or some other organization where he's fighting guys of roughly that level, it's not really ever going to be an issue for him. He has quite clearly graduated from that level, and at least insofar as that left side is concerned, I just don't see how you can argue that's a problem there. If you want to take the Justin Gaethje fight as representative of the kinds of attacks he'd be suffering from as he went to the higher levels, that changes the debate a little bit. Now, would everyone fight like Justin Gaethje? Not necessarily. Maybe in other cases where if Nick Newell's going for the takedown, he would eventually find it. Maybe he wouldn't tire as much as he did like he was in this contest, right? People are going to strike like Justin Gaethje. People are not going to strike like Justin Gaethje. But it stands to reason that when they want to target what they perceive as a certain weakness, they're going to be able to. However, that is also very, 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 very speculative. You don't necessarily have to be the number 1 or 2 or 3 or 4th or 5th best lightweight in this case in the world in order to make it to the Ultimate Fighting Championship. You basically need to be somewhere in that top 25 range. Now you can push that back if a division is even deeper. You can go 35, maybe 40 or so, something like that. Even further back in certain cases beyond that. But that's really what we're talking about here. And to me, if that's the halo of conversation about whether you're going to be inside of that space and competing in that space and what that means for your ability to compete at a reasonable level of success, he's clearly well within inside that. But I would grant that if you want to argue that somebody who's a bit more of a pinpoint striker is going to have a lot more success as he graduates through the ranks, there is at least some evidence to suggest that is true. The question is, does that really matter? Is that the most important one? Is it this impending notion of doom that we think might happen to him, reason to prevent him an opportunity to compete in this space? And I would humbly submit to you, that is a pretty poor argument. Now, here's the truth. I just don't know how far Nick Newell can go. And I am perfectly willing to believe that the guys at the regional level who couldn't take advantage of what people perceive as a potential defense deficiency, I do believe that guys at the next level will have a lot more success in doing that. But it's something to think about. There are guys who compete in all kinds of weight classes in the UFC right now who have really terrible striking defense, who have nevertheless had very long careers. There are all kinds of guys you can point to who might be very good offensive fighters, but not necessarily the best defensive fighters. And as a consequence, it's limited their upside and the kinds of things they've been able to do. There are guys I like very much, like Jean Vellante. I would say I think he's a great guy. I think he's a great addition to the light heavyweight division. There's not a lot of bad things you can say about him, but if we were fairly evaluating his game, striking defense would simply not be a very key element to that. It's not something you can rate him highly on. Maybe there's some other things you could, but not necessarily that. And there's a lot of other guys just like that as well, who hold their hands low, who hold their hands outside, who don't really make use of defense. There are guys who have other kinds of deficiencies, who don't check leg kicks, who have really terrible takedown defense. You can go on and on and on and on and on, pointing to Nick Newell and saying guys at this level are going to be able to take advantage of what they perceive as a deficiency in that striking defense on this side. If that argument is even true, let's just say that it is true for in a second, that wouldn't make Nick Newell in any way exceptional to other fighters already in the UFC who already have similar kinds of problems, even though they're fully able-bodied. To me, there's a lot of hand-wringing going on here about what he can or he can't do. And I think this is really the answer. We don't have enough evidence against elite competition to say what he can and can't do. We can say on that date when he met Justin Gaethje, he couldn't get the job done there, but we can clearly say that at the regional level, he's just better than these guys. Now, there's a big gap in between, and there might be a very clear ceiling on how far he can go in the UFC, but to say that he's at some kind of a unique disadvantage based on all the information we've seen at the regional level, that's not really true. Certainly not true enough to warrant saying he is clearly and separately at some kind of disadvantage to not warrant giving an opportunity to this guy relative to all the opportunities we've given to other people. I hear a lot of people saying with certainty that we know, and we don't. We really don't. We have enough evidence to conclude at one level he has graduated from it. It's quite obvious. As long as he stays in the LFA, I'm not saying he'll win forever, nobody does, but he'll probably do really, really, really well. And I am perfectly willing to admit that I also don't know that if in fact they did take him to the UFC, maybe he does get mollywopped. We cannot exclude that as a possibility either. That seems to me something that I can't say is wrong. I just can't declare with great confidence anything about that next level is true or not true, other than all the things he showed at the regional level make him a perfectly suitable candidate to graduate up to the next level. How he does there is anyone's guess. Now, the data I'm about to show you is very, very flawed, but I wanted to give it to you just as some kind of an illustration about while we can make some bold conclusions, we cannot make bold conclusions in another direction either way. So I look at the win-loss records of his opponents, Nick Newell, as well as Justin Gaethje's since 2012. And his opponents, Nick Newell's, are 101-58, which gives them an overall winning percentage of about 64%. If you go to Justin Gaethje, now they have almost, if not more than 2 times as many fights. It's a little bit different. 286 to 135 in terms of wins and losses, which gives his opponents a winning percentage of about 68%. Now, again, I'm not comparing the quality of the opposition. I'm not suggesting that all the opponents that Justin Gaethje has faced are somehow just the same as the ones that Nick Newell has. Far from it. But again, based on the available data, it's not like the guys he has faced at 64% is markedly different in terms of their overall ability to win at the level at which they've competed is different than the 68%. Now, there's a gazillion caveats on that, including 2 UFC fights that he has. But by the way, one of those UFC fights is against Michael Johnson, a guy with a 17-13 record. And yes, I know he's 17-13 because he's out there fighting the best when Nick Newell's been on the regional scene and looking out. Again, the data does not in any way tell you a complete story. I'm just trying to point out it's not like all the guys he's faced are somehow 0-14 or 2-10 or 5-5. He's fought some guys who have done a lot of really good veteran work at that level. And again, at that level, you can make a bold conclusion that Nick Newell has far surpassed it and is ready for the next level. How he'll do at the next level, well, we just don't have enough data to conclude that. Now, there's a lot of discussion about who is and who isn't UFC level. And people say, oh, there's no such thing as UFC level anymore. We don't know that to be true. I would disagree with that. Now, it is true that it can be very, very difficult to define, and it can be a sliding scale. It's really not the same thing for women's featherweight or even bantamweight as it is for men's lightweight. It can mean a lot of different things. But when you look at the totality of the picture of the UFC, some things begin to be clear. Number one, they have roughly, give or take, about 90% of the world's elite talent in terms of mixed martial arts. Bellator might have close to, I don't know, somewhere around 7 or 8%, somewhere in there. Even if you wanted to say that UFC only had 85 and Bellator had 10, nevertheless, you can just see it's got the overwhelming majority of the best fighters, which means, again, what does UFC level mean? Well, for each division, it's going to be a little bit harder to pin down, but it's going to be roughly something like the top quartile. That's really kind of what you're looking at. Again, we'll have to play a little bit with that as we talk about growing divisions, new divisions, some of the women's divisions, men's flyweight divisions, right? It can be a little bit harder to come by. But we're talking about the people who sit at the very, very top of their respective divisions. That is more or less what UFC level means. Now, that can be hard to figure out because not everybody is going to be top 25. You could be a prospect like Alex Hernandez. No one knows who you are. You come in, you beat Beneil Dariush, and now you get ranked. And is that fair? And what does that say? And other people take time to work their way through and they get signed early. So not everyone has to be exactly in that space. Some can be along the way on different parts of the journey. Some can be much further along. Some can just sort of stay in the same place that they've always been. But you're kind of hovering in that orbit. And there is plenty of evidence to suggest that Nick Newell at least could do as well or better than many of the entrants in the UFC lightweight division, again, based on what we know on what he did in the regional level. So when people say, well, you know, it doesn't even matter what's UFC level anymore, so just let Nick Newell in. Well, I disagree. I do think that Nick Newell should be given an opportunity to fight in the Ultimate Fighting Championship, but not because there's no standard anymore, but because given everything he's been measured against, there's enough evidence to say it's a meritorious signing. One more note about this. You guys ever heard of Anthony Robles? Anthony Robles was a wrestler out of Arizona State, I believe, who won a national title and was an All-American multiple times and was missing a leg. And actually, when he was wrestling, I remember this quite vividly. People were saying, well, the fact that he's missing a leg is actually an advantage, right? Because he could get lower and he could, it was less of a target to attack. I mean, sort of think about how idiotic it must be to say something like missing a leg helps him wrestle. Now, it might actually be true that there were some ways you could construe that as an advantage, but as a net advantage, it's better to have a missing leg. That this is absurd, right? He just, took lemons and made lemonade out of it. Now, what's interesting, though, is that he didn't really go on past the collegiate level into wrestling. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe he just wanted to be the motivational speaker. He had a gig with ESPN in terms of the national championship to be a commentator. There's lots of reasons beyond really the competition itself that could have made that decision possible. Well, one of the reasons also was that he didn't necessarily have a ton of success under the freestyle rule set. Here's him in a match against Michael Duncombe, who had nothing even close to the success that he did on the freestyle, on the collegiate circuit. You know, whatever you want to say about the freestyle attempts that they both had, and neither went particularly all that far necessarily. In terms of winning a medal or placing in a significant international tournament. Nevertheless, Duncan did not have the collegiate success at all that Robles had, and he couldn't do a whole lot against him necessarily in this contest and beyond. It looked like when he went to what was technically the next level, although a bit of a different rule set in wrestling, Robles just it didn't work out for him. So what does this mean about Nick Newell? So this is my point. Right? People are saying, well, I know for a fact he'll do well in the UFC. And others saying, well, I know for a fact he won't. And no one actually knows. It is very possible that he could have had all this success at the regional level and he goes and gets washed at the next level. I don't know. It's also possible he can go there and really surprise some folks. I just want to point out that all we can ask is not necessarily how we'll think he'll do, although I think it's not an irrelevant question. It's just one that's very hard to answer. The question is, has he shown enough against the right kinds of opponents in the right kinds of circumstance to warrant being considered a part of potentially the top quartile of the top 100 in his weight class? And I think the answer to that is an unequivocal yes. And by the way, for folks who are wondering, I've seen, this is just MMA fighting trying to push an agenda for a disabled fighter. Not really. Again, if he doesn't get it, he doesn't get it. He's not owed anything. But a couple things to keep in mind. I don't want to conflate being disabled with being a woman, but there were some of the same arguments trotted out about women fighting in the UFC, that if they got beat up, this would make the product look bad. Not true. That there would be no market for it. Not true. And I can tell you that in terms of and there's not a lot of disabled enough to have a market for it per se, but the point being is people tune out of Nick Newell fights either because they have this paternalistic instinct or because it would somehow offend their sensibilities. I just don't buy any of that. And by the way, you should note that in terms of the interest in Nick Newell, now he's been gone for a while, but historically you can place him as one of the most high interest fighters outside the UFC ever. The mainstream press does stories on him much more than other fighters outside of the UFC, many more than even inside the UFC. And I think if he got signed to the UFC and he had even a modicum of success, there would be a ton of eyeballs on him. So even as a business case, it makes a lot of sense to sign him. However, I would submit to you that's not the reason to do it, just as it's not the reason to sign a CM Punk or not the reason to sign anybody else. Either you can fight at this level or you can't, and either you deserve an opportunity to prove you can fight this level or you don't, or you can't get it, because, of course, it's not owed. But I believe that the UFC could make this work. They should at least try to make this work, and if he washes out, well, then he washes out. But it's hard for me to see exactly what they lose here. And last but not least, we take a look at what's coming up in the week ahead. For this weekend, we have a Fight Pass event. God, it feels like it's been a while since we had one of those. I guess the Poland event, right? The Gdansk fight. In any case, this will be UFC Fight Night 127, or UFC Fight Night Verdum versus Volkov, or UFC Fight Night London. Takes place at the O2 Arena in, of course, London, England. Your main event, Fabricio Verdum taking on Alexander Volkov. Your light heavyweight co-main, Jimmy Manuwa versus Jan Blachowicz. Then it's Tom Duquesnoy versus Terrion Ware, two guys who were beaten by Cody Stamann. Then Leon Edwards versus Peter Sobotta. That's your 4-fight main card. You now move to the prelim card. Of course, both will be on Fight Pass. John Phillips taking on Charles Byrd. Danny Robbins versus Oliver Enkamp. Jack Marshman versus Brad Scott. Danny Henry versus Hakeem Dawadu. Paul Craig versus Magomed Ankalaev. Mark Godbeer versus Dmitry Sosnovsky. Nasrat Hakparast is still on there against TBD. And then Cajun Johnson opening the show against Stevie Ray. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Bitches, gripes, smartass remarks. You can send them all to lukethomasnews@gmail.com. Hopefully we'll have some great action from this event to break down next weekend, or next Monday, I should say, but over the weekend, of course. I appreciate you guys tuning in. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time, and until then, enjoy the fights.